Good evening, dear friends, and welcome back to Warm Tales. I am Khadi. Before we begin, how are you? Genuinely. Drop it in the comments. And wherever you are in the world right now, I'm glad you found your way here. If you enjoy these stories, a subscription means a great deal. Now, settle in and let us begin. Chapter 1. The Clearing of Linden House. The frost had come early to St. Mary Mead that October. It arrived on a Tuesday, the way the first frost always does, quietly, in the hours before dawn, laying itself across the village with a kind of apologetic discretion, as though it had not wished to be noticed yet. By 7 in the morning, the whole of the lane behind the church wore a fine silver coat, and the last of the roses in Mrs. Bantry's front hedge had gone stiff and inward, the petals closing like a letter nobody was ready to send. Miss Marple had been up since 6:30, as she always was. She had made her tea, 1½ spoons of Darjeeling, steeped for precisely 4 minutes, no more, and had carried it to the sitting-room window, where the light at that hour came through the elm at the lane's edge and divided itself into thin, pale columns across the floor. She stood there for a time with both hands around the cup, watching a robin on the garden wall attend to its own small business with the self-important industry that robins always bring to October. She was wearing the cardigan with the replaced buttons, the good gray one, and her hair was already pinned, because Miss Marple had never seen any reason why a person alone in her own sitting room at 6:30 should be less orderly than a person receiving company at 4 in the afternoon. Order was not, in her private understanding of things, a performance. It was simply the condition under which the mind worked best. The village, she could see from the window, was beginning its morning. Arthur Plimpton from the post office was cycling down the high street with his lamp on, though the sky had lightened enough that he no longer needed it. The lamp was a habit. Arthur was a man of habits. And habits, Miss Marple had always found, were deeply informative once you understood whose habits they were and which ones they chose to keep even when the occasion no longer required them. She finished her tea. She went to the kitchen. She toasted 1 slice of bread, spread it thinly with marmalade, and ate it standing at the kitchen window, looking into the garden, where the kitchen garden beds were already done for the year. The last of the leeks pulled, the beds turned and mulched, everything put properly to sleep beneath their covers of straw. She felt the particular satisfaction of a garden well prepared for winter, not the excitement of spring's beginning, nor the pleasure of summer's abundance, but something quieter and more permanent than either. The satisfaction of having done the right thing at the right time, so that the right things could happen again when the right time returned. It was while she was washing up her cup and plate, she did not leave things in the sink, that she first heard the lorry. It came along the hayfield road from the direction of the market town, which meant it was not a delivery lorry, and it was moving slowly, which meant it was not passing through. She heard it slow further and stop, and then the particular mechanical settling of an engine being cut, and then doors, 2, then a third. She did not go to look. She dried her hands, hung the cloth over the rail, and went upstairs to dress properly. She would see what it was on her walk. St. Mary Mead at 8 in the morning in October was a different village than it would be at noon or at 4. At 8, it had the quality of a sentence not yet fully spoken, the words accumulating, the meaning not yet clear. The shops were opening their shutters in stages. Mrs. Harding at the greengrocer's was arranging apples in the window with the considered placement of a curator, each apple positioned at a slight angle that was neither random nor obvious. The church clock was preparing itself, in the way church clocks do, to strike the hour approximately, not wrongly, exactly, but with a mild margin of error that the village had long accepted as a kind of personality. Miss Marple walked along the high street with her stick and her basket, nodding to those she passed, pausing briefly at the greengrocer's to admire the apples and to purchase 2 coxes and a small bunch of late parsley, and then turned right on a Church Lane, which was the longer way to the post office but the more informative one. She knew before she turned the corner what she would find. The lorry was from Granger's of Hertford, a house clearance firm, and it was parked on a verge in front of Linden House. Linden House had been empty for 3 years. It had been empty in the truest sense for rather longer than that. It was a house of the mid-Victorian period, set a little way back from the lane behind a garden wall of old brick that had long since given itself over to ivy and the creeping stems of a Virginia creeper that in October burned a deep and silent red. The linden tree that had given the house its name was still there, enormously old now, its highest branches bare, while the lower ones held their yellow leaves with the careful reluctance of a person who knows they must eventually let something go but has not quite decided to. 2 men from Granger's were carrying a chest of drawers out of the front door and down the path with the impersonal efficiency of their profession, objects reduced, in their hands, to dimensions and weight, history having no bearing on the calculation. Miss Marple stood at the gate. She did not go in. The gate was latched, a low iron gate, original, painted black in years past, though the paint had long since given way to rust at the hinges, and she had no reason to open it. She simply stood, as any person might stand, looking at a house being cleared. A young woman came out of the front door behind the man. She was perhaps 30, dressed in dark trousers and a good coat, and she was carrying a cardboard box which appeared to contain papers, folders, a ledger of some kind, bundles of letters secured with rubber bands that had gone brown with age. She set the box down on the front step, looked up, and saw Miss Marple at the gate. "Good morning," the young woman said. "Good morning," said Miss Marple. "I hope you'll forgive my looking. I've lived in this village a great many years, and one becomes attached to the houses one has watched for so long." The young woman came down the path. She had a neat, serious face and dark eyes that assessed things quickly without appearing to. "You knew the family?" "The Unravelings." "Yes, I did. Not well. They were a private family. But in a village one knows everyone, at least at the edges." "I'm the solicitor's clerk," the young woman said, "managing the estate. The last of the family died in June, a great niece in Bristol. She had no interest in the house, which I can understand. It's been in a state." "It has," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "Houses feel it when they're left alone for a long time." The young woman picked up her cardboard box. "We're sending most of the contents to auction. The papers will go to the county archive, for the most part. There's a great deal of correspondence from the 1920s, apparently of some local historical interest. The solicitor felt it was better preserved than destroyed." "That was thoughtful of him," said Miss Marple. The young woman went back inside. Miss Marple remained at the gate for a moment longer, her eyes moving over the house, the blank windows, the front door standing open for the first time in years, the Virginia creeper's deep October red against the old brick. Something moved in her, not a thought exactly, but the precursor to a thought. The sensation she had come to recognize over many decades, the way one sometimes senses a change in the air before any visible sign of weather. A shift in the interior atmosphere. A door opening, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, onto a room she had not visited in a very long time. The Unravelings. She stood there one more moment. Then she went on with her walk. Chapter 2. What the Village Remembers. She did her errands in order, as she always did. Post office first, a letter to her nephew Raymond in London, and the renewal of a magazine subscription. Then back along the high street to Benson's for stamps, because Benson's was also the stationer's and she needed a new notebook. Then the greengrocer's again, because she had forgotten lemons. And then the brief and always slightly bracing conversation with Colonel Bantry's widow at the corner, who wished to talk about the new people who had taken the old vicarage and who appeared to own a dog of uncertain breed and even less certain manners. Miss Marple listened to everything, as she always did, with the attentive courtesy that people often mistook for passive deference, but which was, in reality, the most active form of reception she possessed. She missed nothing. She discarded almost nothing. She was particularly interested in casual asides, those small, throwaway observations that a person makes when they believe the listener's attention is elsewhere. But this morning she did not hear anything that caught at her in the particular way something was already catching. The something was Linden House. Or rather, not the house itself, but the surfacing of its name. The way it had come back into the ordinary stream of village life that morning, carried there by a lorry from Hertford and a cardboard box of old papers. The way the Virginia creeper had been so extravagantly red. The way the linden tree had been holding its last leaves. She did not pursue it. That was not her method. If method was even the right word for something she had never consciously developed, but had simply found herself doing as a person finds themselves with a habit they cannot remember acquiring. She did not pursue these stirrings of memory. She set them alongside whatever she was doing and allowed them to develop in their own time, the way you set bread dough in a warm place, and then go about your day and come back to find it has done what it needed to do. She had lunch at home, the remainder of a vegetable soup from the previous day, with toast, and then a small piece of hard cheese. She ate at the kitchen table with the radio on low, a program about migratory birds that she found soothing without finding it interesting, the way she found many things soothing without finding them interesting. After lunch, she sat in the sitting room with a book she was reading, a history of the English hedgerow, which was considerably more gripping than it sounded, and attempted to read. The attempt was not entirely successful. She read the same paragraph 3 times, found it yielding no more on the third reading than the first, and set the book down in her lap. The Laverings. Thomas Lavering. His wife, Doris. Their son, Edmund. Edmund Lavering. The name surfaced in her mind the way something surfaces in a slow current. Not with a splash, not dramatically, but rising steadily from depth until it broke the surface and lay there in the light where she could see it. Edmund Lavering. He would have been, she calculated, as she always did, with reference to specific events rather than abstract arithmetic. He would have been about 18 when she had last seen him, which meant he would be 68 now, if he were alive, or 69, depending on his month of birth, which she thought had been late in the year, November perhaps, or December. She did not know where he was. She had not heard his name in, she thought, 40 years or more. He had left. That was the sum of what she knew, or thought she knew. He had left St. Mary Mead Inn. When? She set the book on the side table and looked at the fire, which was burning with the steady, self-sufficient contentment of a well-laid fire that has found its proper pace. He had left. After the summer of she counted back, the summer of 1973 or 1974. She was not certain which. There had been a summer in that period, and now the details were not coming clearly, which was unusual, associated with Linden House, and with Edmund, and with something else that she had noticed and then had had no occasion to think about again for a very long time. What she noticed, she sat with the question. She did not force it. She returned to her book, read 2 more paragraphs, which this time she properly absorbed. The hedgerow as a linear woodland, harboring the same species as would an ancient forest, but distributed through time and space differently, and then set the book down once more, because the memory was beginning to move. A letter. There had been a letter, or talk of a letter. Someone at the village institute. Mrs. Patmore, was it? No. Patmore had come later. Someone else. A woman with a green hat who always wore it slightly to one side, and who had been saying to someone, but who? That it was all very irregular, and that there ought to have been a will, and that she had it on the best authority that the solicitor himself was not entirely satisfied. A will. Miss Marple set this down in the careful interior place where she kept things not yet ready to be examined, and went back to her book. Chapter 3. The Autumn Kitchen Garden. The following morning was less frosty, but colder in an absolute sense. The frost having done its work and withdrawn, leaving behind a low gray sky, and the particular cold that comes without wind, which is deeper and stiller than any wind-carried chill. Miss Marple dressed in her tweed walking coat over 2 layers, tied her good scarf at the throat, and went out into the kitchen garden at 9:30 to check on the cold frames. This was not strictly necessary. She had checked them 2 days ago, and there was nothing in them that required urgent attention. But the kitchen garden in October required a certain quality of presence that was not exactly work and was not exactly inspection, more like the attentive companionship that a person provides to something that cannot ask for it, but benefits from it nonetheless. She moved along the frames, noting the condition of the small lettuces she was attempting to carry through the winter, the spinach seedlings that were doing rather better than she had expected, the parsley which was battered but surviving. She was thinking about Edmond Lavering, not deliberately. She was thinking about the cold frames and whether the additional layer of insulation she had placed along the north side had been sufficient, and somewhere below this practical consideration, the way a river runs below its own ice, she was thinking about Edmond Lavering. He had been. She paused, straightening from the frame, one hand on her back. He had been a rather quiet boy. Not shy exactly, but self-contained in a way that in a young person can look like shyness to those who are not paying careful attention. She had seen him in the village regularly during his childhood, at the summer fete, at the church at Christmas, in the high street on Saturday mornings with his mother. He had been courteous in the way of boys who have been properly brought up. He stood when adults entered a room. He held doors. He answered questions directly and without the sullenness that some boys of his age brought to adult conversation. She had not known his parents well. Thomas Lavering had been in some branch of finance. She thought insurance, but was not certain, and had had the manner of a man who conducts the visible portions of his life with thorough competence and keeps everything else entirely to himself. She had found him perfectly pleasant and not particularly comprehensible, which was her private assessment of a number of men of that generation and background. Doris Lavering had been quieter still, a thin, careful woman with a habit of deference that went beyond social courtesy into something that had always struck Miss Marple as slightly anxious in its character. The family had kept to themselves. This was respected in St. Mary Mead. Privacy was not considered, in the village, to be an eccentricity or a failing, provided it came with the regular and proper performance of civic courtesy. Church twice a month, the summer fete, the harvest festival, school governors' meetings when the children were of age. The Laverings had done all of this. They had been private without being mysterious, which is a distinction that matters. Edmund had gone to university. Bristol, she thought, or possibly Sheffield. His father had been very correct and slightly proud about this, mentioning it in passing at the autumn fete. She could see Thomas Lavering's face quite clearly now, standing by the cake stall with a cup of tea, the particular expression of a man delivering information he is pleased about, but is trying not to appear pleased about, because to appear too pleased would be to suggest that the outcome had ever been in doubt. Then Edmund had come home for the summer after his first year, or perhaps his second. And then she stopped at the end of the path. The cold frames were fine. She stood looking at the far wall of the kitchen garden, where the old espalier pear had been trained across the old brick for so long that it was now, in its winter state of bare branches spread against the pale stone, as much architecture as tree. Then Edmund had not gone back. That was what she was remembering now. He had come home for the summer, and he had not gone back to university in September. And she could not now remember, as she stood in her kitchen garden on an October morning 50-odd years later, what reason had been given, or whether any had. She went inside. She made a fresh pot of tea. She stood at the window while it steeped, watching the robin, who was back on the garden wall with a worm of considerable ambition, and she thought about the summer Edmund Lavering had come home and not gone back. The village, she reflected, pouring her tea and carrying it to the sitting room. The village remembered things, but it remembered them the way water remembers the shape of the vessel it was once kept in. The shape was retained in the substance, but it was only visible when you held the substance in the right light. She had been here. She had been here that whole summer. 1974. She was now fairly certain it was 1974 because the summer of 1974 had been the summer the Hartley girls had both moved to Edinburgh within the same month, and the village had buzzed about that for weeks, which had placed a kind of temporal marker on the whole season that made it now accessible. She calculated, she had been 53, or thereabouts, old enough to know how much she had not been paying full attention. She had been aware that summer of something at Linden House. Not an event, not an incident, nothing with a shape clear enough to have demanded attention. More of a change in the quality of the ordinary. Thomas Lavaring had seemed, that summer, more closed-in than usual, if that were possible. She had passed him on Church Lane once in August, she thought, and he had been walking very quickly for a warm day, and had acknowledged her with a nod of the sort that did not invite conversation. And she had had the impression, no more than that, no more than an impression, that he was a man walking away from something he had just left and towards something he had not yet decided how to face. She filed this away. She knew she had filed at the time. She was beginning to remember the label she had written on the file all those years ago. Thomas Lavaring. August 1974. Something at the house. But she had never opened the file again, because nothing had required her to. Until now. Chapter 4. Letters in the Current. She walked the lane that afternoon, the long lane out past the church, along the edge of the field that in summer held barley, and in autumn held the memory of barley, and in winter held the particular lonely patience of emptiness, and she thought about the letter. Someone had talked about a letter, or about the absence of a letter, or about a letter that should have existed and did not, or that existed but had not been read, or had been read by the wrong person. She walked slowly. The hedgerow on her left was a proper hedgerow, old and mixed and richly specific in a way that her hedgerow book had given her new vocabulary for appreciating. She could see the hawthorn and the blackthorn, the occasional holly with its berries still dark red, the elder whose leaves had gone to brown paper. The field on her right had been plowed in September, and the earth had been working since then in its slow winter preparation, the action invisible from the surface. A letter, written to Edmund, or by Edmund. She could not determine which. She turned this over as she walked, the way you turn a stone at the edge of a stream to see what is under it. The stone was heavy, and her grip on it was uncertain, but it was moving. By Edmund. The letter had been written by Edmund. She stopped. A blackbird in the hedgerow made its sharp alarm call and went out low across the field, its wings strong and direct. She watched it go. By Edmund. She was now fairly certain. And the woman in the green hat, whose name was beginning to surface, the way names do when you stop reaching for them. The woman in the green hat had said it was all very irregular, and that there ought to have been a will. But that had been later. That had been after Thomas Lavaring died, which had been, she was now testing dates against each other like keys against a lock, which had been, she was fairly certain, 1976. 18 months, or perhaps 2 years after Edmund had not returned to university. So, Edmund had not returned in September 1974. Edmund had written a letter to whom? To his father? To the solicitor? And then what? Gone? Stayed? Gone. She was now quite certain he had gone, because she had not seen him after that summer. She had been aware of his absence from the village in the way you are aware of the absence of a familiar sound after it has stopped. Not consciously, not in a way that demands investigation, but in the texture of the ordinary. He had gone, and then, 18 months or 2 years later, his father had died. And someone had said, in the green hat, that there ought to have been a will, and that the solicitor was not satisfied. She walked on. The afternoon light was already dropping. It always dropped early here in October, the short days establishing themselves with the gentle inexorability of a season that has decided it is now in charge. The field on her right was going gray. The hedgerow retained its shape against the diminishing light. Thomas Lavaring had died without a will, or with a will that was disputed, or with a will that could not be found. And Edmund had already gone. And Doris Lavaring. She stopped again, this time less visibly, just a pause in the walking. Doris Leverang had continued to live in Linden House for, she thought, another 10 years or more. Alone, very quietly, in the way of a woman who has been reduced to the minimum of her life and continues in that minimum without complaint, because complaint was not in her character or was no longer possible. She went home. She made her supper, lamb chop, potato, the last of the parsley from the garden. She ate at the kitchen table. She washed up. She went to the sitting room fire. Some things return, whether you invite them to or not. She sat with this for a long time. The fire settled. The clock on the mantelpiece made its small sounds. Outside, the village was quiet in the way of October evenings. The dark having come fully down, everything held within its own particular radius of lamplit warmth. She had been here the whole time. All of it. The summer, the letter, the will, the death, the solitary years of Doris. She had been here for all of it, and she had filed each piece separately, and now the files were beginning to move toward each other like clouds in a slow wind, and she could see that when they finally came together they would form something with a definite shape. She could not yet see the full shape, but she could see that it was there to be seen. Chapter 5. The Lane Behind the Church. On Thursday morning, she walked deliberately to Church Lane. She did not tell herself she was doing this. She told herself she was walking to the church to look at the churchyard, as she sometimes did in autumn when the light on the old stones was particularly good, which was true. She also told herself she needed to speak to the new verger about the autumn flower rhoda, which was slightly less true. The rhoda did not require her attention for another 3 weeks, but was not entirely untrue. Church Lane in October morning light was very quiet. The elms had mostly finished losing their leaves, and the lane was carpeted in a deep bronze and brown that muffled her footsteps in a pleasant way. A cat from one of the cottages, a very old ginger cat she had known for some years, watched her from a wall with the judicial composure of the very elderly. She walked past the church gate without stopping and continued along the lane to where Linden House stood. The clearance lorry was gone. The house was closed again, its windows blank, but it was a different blankness now. A house that had been opened and emptied was different from a house that had simply been closed for a long time. Something of its interior had come out into the air, and the air was changed by it. She stood at the gate. The Virginia creeper had begun, in the 2 days since her last visit, to release more of its leaves. The red was fading at the edges, the color bleeding into brown at the margins the way color in old photographs bleeds at the edges, and several of the lower stems had let go entirely, revealing patches of the old brick beneath, a softer, older red, the color of the creeper's youth. She unlatched the gate. She had no right to enter. The property was under the management of the solicitor's firm, the estate not yet settled. But she thought, if asked, she could say with perfect honesty that she had wished to look at the garden, which had been, once, very fine. She walked up the path. She stood on the front step, where the young woman had set the cardboard box of papers. She looked at the front door. It was closed and latched, but not locked. She could see that the deadlock was not engaged, the keyhole empty. She did not try the handle. She turned and looked out from the step at the garden. The garden had gone, in the years of the house's emptiness, from a maintained garden into something that was beginning to find its own way without human intention. The rose beds along the wall had become rose thicket, the canes arching and layering and rooting themselves in new places, so that what had once been a shaped planting had become a low, dense tangle of old wood and new growth, extraordinary in its way, the roses having found a freedom they had not been bred to look for, and having made of it something wilder and more vital than their original purpose. The lawn had given itself over to meadow, the grasses tall, and now autumn flattened, the whole surface pale and supple, and through it, here and there, the rosettes of plants that had seeded themselves from the old borders. Foxglove, honesty, the silver discs of the honesty's seed pods catching what light there was. It was in looking at the honesty that she noticed it. Along the left-hand wall, Half hidden by the autumn growth of the rose thicket, there was a small outbuilding. She had known it was there. She had known the garden of Linden House well enough to know its outlines. But she had not, until this moment, given it any specific attention. It was a garden store, or had been a single-room structure of the same old brick as the house, with a flat roof and a wooden door that was now standing very slightly open. The door was open. This was specific. She had not been in this garden 2 days ago, and there had been no reason for the clearance men to have come to the outbuilding. They had been dealing with the house's contents, not the garden. And yet the door was open. Not fully, perhaps 2 inches, but open. She crossed the garden, moving through the tall grass with the careful deliberateness of someone who is paying attention to where she steps. She reached the outbuilding. She stood at the door. She pushed it a few inches further with the tip of her stick. Inside, shelves mostly empty. Garden tools of great age, a rusted fork, the remains of a cultivator that had lost 2 of its tines. On the lowest shelf, a row of old terracotta pots, still containing the dried remains of what appeared to have been cuttings dried to dust years ago. And on the floor, just inside the door, she looked at it carefully, without moving, a pair of muddy boots. Men's boots, a large size, the mud fresh. Not the mud of yesterday or the day before, which would have dried and paled. Fresh mud, dark and wet-looking, which meant they had been left there this morning or very recently. She stood with this piece of information for 10 seconds, perhaps 15. Then she withdrew the stick, stepped back, walked calmly back across the garden, let herself out through the iron gate, and continued along Church Lane to the church, where she spoke to the verger about the flower rhoda, which she had now decided needed her attention after all. She walked home by the long way. Someone had been in the outbuilding at Linden House. Someone had left boots there, not the boots of a workman, not the boots of someone connected with the estate clearance, because estate clearance people wore the same boots out as they wore in. These were a second pair, left deliberately in a specific location in a garden of a house that was supposedly empty and locked and belonging to an estate not yet settled. She did not allow herself to conclude too much from this. What she noted in the careful, neutral inventory of her attention was fresh mud, large boots, deliberately placed, outbuilding of a house otherwise empty, door closed until today. Someone had been there recently. Someone who had a reason to enter that specific garden. Not the house, but the garden, and who had left boots in the outbuilding in the way that a person leaves something they intend to return for. She thought about Edmund Lavering. She thought about his father, Thomas. She thought about the summer of 1974 and the letter that had been written and the will that had either not existed or not been found. Then she thought about the young woman with the serious face who was managing the estate on behalf of the solicitor's firm, and the cardboard box of old papers, the folders, the ledger, the bundles of letters with dried rubber bands that she had carried down the path at 8 in the morning 2 days ago. Chapter 6. The Solicitor's Archive. On Friday afternoon, she went to Harlan's. Harlan's was the solicitor's firm in the village, not the large firm in the market town, which handled most of the commercial work and some of the more complex estates, but the old village firm that had been in the same premises on the high street since 1902 and that had the particular quality of an institution that has survived long enough to become invisible, so thoroughly embedded in the texture of the village that people no longer thought of it as separate from the village any more than. They thought of the church or the post office as separate. It was simply there, as things of long standing simply are. The solicitor was now the 3rd generation. Young Mr. Harland, as he was still called, though he was now past 40 and had been young Mr. Harland for 2 decades. His grandfather had handled Thomas Lavering's affairs. His father had seen the estate through the period of Doris Lavering's widowhood. Young Mr. Harland himself had, she presumed, dealt with whatever had been required when Doris had eventually, that must have been the late 1980s, she thought, moved into the nursing home, and then eventually died. She had telephoned ahead, which she considered essential courtesy. She had said she had a small question about a local property matter, which was true, and he had said he had a gap at 3 o'clock, which was also true. Young Mr. Harland received her in the front office, which had the good smell of an office that has been an office for a long time, paper and beeswax, and a faint ghost of wood smoke from the fireplace, which was lit. He was a lean, careful man with good manners and the slightly wary expression of a solicitor who has learned from experience that elderly ladies with small questions are not always asking them for small reasons. Miss Marple, he said, bringing her the better chair. He always brought her the better chair, without being asked, which she appreciated. Thank you for calling ahead. How can I help? It's very good of you to see me, she said, settling herself. I wanted to ask about Linden House. I saw the clearance being done on Tuesday morning. Ah, he said. He was being careful already. She noted this. Yes, the estate of the late Miss Wyndham. She was a great-niece of the Unraveling family, through the female line. No direct descendants. The house has been standing empty since old Mrs. Unraveling's time, more or less. There were a few tenancy arrangements in the 90s, but nothing that stuck. I see, said Miss Marple. A very long time for a house to wait. It is, he agreed. The papers have gone to the county archive. There is correspondence going back to the early part of the century, as well as the more recent family papers. My understanding is that a good deal of it is of local historical interest. The family papers, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Thomas Unraveling's estate. That would have been handled by your father, I think. Or your grandfather. My father, he said. 1976, that was. A straightforward enough matter, in the end, though there was some difficulty at the time. I remember there was some difficulty, said Miss Marple. I was living here, of course. I don't remember the details clearly, but I had the impression that the will had not been found immediately. Young Mr. Harland looked at her with the expression of a man who is calculating exactly how much information is appropriate to share with a person who appears to know somewhat more than she is letting on. This was, she had always found, the most productive expression to produce in a solicitor, the expression that arrives just before they decide to share a moderate amount, on the calculation that sharing a moderate amount is safer than refusing entirely. There was a will, he said. It was found eventually, in the outbuilding, as it happened, among some garden records of all places. My father always thought it had been placed there accidentally, or well, he had other thoughts, but they weren't ones he ever put in writing, as was correct. Quite correct, said Miss Marple warmly. A solicitor is right to keep his own counsel on matters that cannot be proved. Did the will, if you can say, did the will make the provisions one would have expected? He was quiet for a moment. He was, she thought, weighing the 50 years that had passed against the living interests of any parties, and finding that 50 years was a considerable weight. The house and the principal estate went to Mrs. Unraveling, he said, which was expected. There had been, I believe, a previous draft that included a specific bequest to the son, Edmund. That draft was superseded by the one found in the outbuilding. The one that was found made no bequest to Edmund whatsoever. I see, said Miss Marple. He was not at the reading, said young Mr. Harland. Edmund. He had, as I understand it, already left the area by then. My father made efforts to contact him, without success at the time. At the time, said Miss Marple. He was eventually located, said young Mr. Harland carefully, some years later. In Australia, by then. My father corresponded with him. Edmund accepted the situation. He asked no questions about the will. My father noted this, though not in the official file. He seemed, in my father's view, unsurprised by its contents. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. That is very interesting, she said quietly. Thank you so much for your patience with an old woman's curiosity. There is one more small thing I wondered about. Of course, he said. The outbuilding, she said. Has it been cleared? I noticed, when I walked past on Thursday, that the door appeared to be open. He looked at her steadily. It should be locked, he said. I'll speak to the site supervisor." "I'm sure it's nothing," said Miss Marple pleasantly, and stood and thanked him and left. She walked home along the high street in the October afternoon, the light low and golden and very clear, the way October light is when it has decided to be kind for a day. She passed the greengrocer's, where Mrs. Harding was bringing the apples in for the evening. She stopped to buy a lemon, which she had again forgotten, and to say good evening, and to notice, in her quiet, unstopped, unspectacular way, that the world was continuing to be itself while she was thinking about things it did not yet know had been brought to the surface. The outbuilding. The wolf found in the outbuilding. Fresh boots at the outbuilding door. Edmund had been in Australia. Edmund had known, without asking questions, that the will would contain nothing for him, which meant Edmund had known about the will before his father died. Had known, or had arranged, no. She would not run ahead. She would walk at her own pace, which had always served her better. She went home, made tea, and sat by the fire. Chapter 7. 2 old women and a long afternoon. On Saturday, she went to see Dorothy Phelps. Dorothy Phelps was 86 and lived in the cottage opposite the old forge, which was now a pottery studio owned by a young couple from London who made very beautiful objects and sold them at a considerable premium, which Miss Marple considered entirely appropriate. Beauty has always been worth what people are willing to pay for it, and the young couple from London were paying a rather different price, in daily effort and northern weather, than the price on the label suggested. Dorothy had been in St. Mary Mead longer than anyone except Miss Marple herself, and had the kind of memory that Miss Marple entirely respected, not the dramatic, vivid memory of someone who recalls events in their entirety, but the precise and lateral memory of a woman who had spent 86 years paying attention to the corners of things while everyone else was looking at the centers. They had known each other for 60 years. They were not friends in the sentimental sense. They were too similar in temperament for the easy warmth of friendship, both being too observant to be fully comfortable with each other. But they were in the truest sense contemporaries. They had been here together through the same decades. They shared, as a consequence, a file of the same village, organized according to 2 different but complementary systems. Dorothy's cottage was warm, over-warm, in the way of the very elderly who have found that the cost of being too cold is greater than the cost of being too warm. A small fire, a very good kettle, a large tabby cat on the hearthrug in a state of advanced contentment. Miss Marple removed her coat and scarf and sat in the chair she always used, which had the slight advantage in height that she preferred. Dorothy poured the tea. She moved carefully but not slowly. She had the economy of motion of someone who has learned, over a long life, that no action need be wasted if it is properly planned. "I've been thinking about Linden House," Miss Marple said, when they had done the necessary preliminary business of the tea and the biscuits and a brief acknowledgment of the weather. "Have you?" said Dorothy. "Not question. They've been clearing it." "Granger's?" "I saw the lorry," Dorothy said. "Tuesday morning. The last of the Unraveling line has died, apparently. A great-niece in Bristol," said Dorothy. She was looking at the fire with the expression of a woman visiting a time she has not thought about in years, approaching it the way one approaches a place one has not been since childhood, carefully, with the prior knowledge that it will be both smaller and stranger than memory has kept it. "Do you remember that summer?" Miss Marple said. 1974. The summer Edmund came home and then didn't go back. "I remember it," Dorothy said, not elaborating. "Waiting. I've been trying to remember what the circumstances were." "Precisely." Dorothy was quiet for a moment, turning her cup in her hands. The tabby opened one eye and then closed it again. "He came home in June," Dorothy said. "He'd finished his 2nd year. He had a friend with him, another young man, who stayed for the better part of a fortnight. I don't recall the friend's name. They were very much in each other's company that summer." Miss Marple waited. "Thomas Unraveling did not care for the friendship," Dorothy said. "I say that carefully. I did not witness anything directly, but I saw Thomas in the high street in July, late July, I think, and he had the look of a man who has decided something and is not comfortable with what he has decided. Who told you about the letter? Miss Marple asked. Dorothy looked at her. How did you know I knew about a letter? You kept something back when I mentioned Edmund, Miss Marple said simply. As one does, when one knows a detail that changes the shape of a story. Dorothy set her cup down. Margaret Calhoun, she said. That was the name I could never quite place. Yes, it was Margaret who told me. She had been to see Doris Levering in August. The second week of August, I think. And she said that Doris had been, she used the word diminished, smaller than usual, more careful. What had Doris said? She hadn't said anything directly. But Margaret had been in the house long enough. She was helping Doris with something in the kitchen, I believe a jam session or something of that sort, to hear something from the study. Raised voices, Thomas and Edmund, and then a door, very firmly, and then footsteps on the stairs. And Edmund had not come down again while Margaret was there. That would have been before he left, Miss Marple said. Within the week, I think, said Dorothy. Yes, he left very soon after. And then, she paused, and then Thomas said Edmund had decided to take some time before going back to his studies. Miss Marple said, or some variation on that. Something of that kind. It was not questioned. Young people made different choices in those days. Took time, as you say. It was not extraordinary. And then Edmund's letter. Yes, Dorothy said. A letter Edmund left with the family solicitor, the elder Mr. Harland, before he went. A letter that was not to be read unless something happened to his father, which is an odd instruction for a young man of 20 to leave with a solicitor. Miss Marple was very still. Something happened to his father 2 years later, Dorothy said, and the letter was read. And then, I don't know what happened next precisely. Mr. Harland Sr. was not a man who shared what he knew. But Margaret Calhoun, who was a friend of his wife, said that Mr. Harland had been very quiet about it, that he had told her only that the letter contained information that would have been relevant to the will, and that the will he had been given to file had not been the will he had been expecting. The fire shifted. The tabby stood, stretched with the elongated deliberateness of a cat that has been comfortable for too long and resettled itself in a different position. Edmund knew, Miss Marple said. I believe so, Dorothy said. I believe Edmund knew what his father intended to do with the will. He had been told. He had left. He had left a letter saying what he knew, in case something happened. And the will in the outbuilding. Dorothy looked at her. I don't know about that. The elder Mr. Harland found the will in the outbuilding, Miss Marple said, among garden records. The will that superseded a previous draft. The will that left nothing to Edmund. Dorothy was quiet for a long time. The October afternoon had moved beyond the window while they had been talking, the light changing from pale gold to a clear, thin gray that was neither day nor dusk, but the brief interval between them. Thomas Levering, Dorothy said finally, was a man who had decided something. And when Thomas Levering decided something, even something that cost him his son, he did it thoroughly and did not look back. No, said Miss Marple. I don't imagine he did. She finished her tea. She declined the offer of another cup. She put on her coat and scarf at the door and thanked Dorothy, who said there was no need to thank her, and that she had always thought someone should have done something back then, and that she was glad to have had the conversation even 50 years too late. Miss Marple walked home in the early dark, the lane lit by the lamp at the corner of the high street, the trees overhead a solid darkness against a sky that still held the faintest memory of the gone day. Chapter 8. The Full Circuit. She slept well that night, which surprised her slightly. She had expected to lie awake with the assembled pieces of it, turning them over, examining their joints, testing the structure of what she was beginning to see. But she slept 7 hours and woke at 6:30 in the full knowledge that she had been working while she slept, in the way that the mind sometimes does its deepest work in the hours that the waking self believes are given over to rest. She made her tea. She dressed. She went out at 9 into an October morning that was clear and cold and still, the sky a pale blue unmarked by any cloud, the frost again on the lane, more comprehensive than Tuesdays, the whole world silver-edged and precise. She walked her full circuit, the long way, past the church, along Church Lane. She did not stop at Linden House, but she looked at it as she passed, and the gate was latched, and the outbuilding door was now firmly closed, which told her that young Mr. Harland had been as good as his word. Then along the field path, then the farm track behind the old mill, then back through the village by the high street. 2 miles, roughly. She did it slowly, and the whole thing assembled itself as she walked, not rushing her, giving itself to her in the order it had been waiting to give itself, the order that corresponded to the order in which it had actually happened. Edmund Laveraing had been 20 years old in the summer of 1974. He had come home from university with a friend, a particular friend, and Thomas Laveraing had seen the friendship for what it was. Thomas Laveraing had been a man of his time, his class, his generation, in the worst and most specific way that these descriptions carry. He had understood what his son was, and he had decided that what his son was would not be tolerated. He had told Edmund this. He had told him with the thoroughness of a man who does not do things by halves. He had removed him from the will, not the current will, but the working draft that Edmund had presumably seen or been told about, or had every reason to expect would reflect what any reasonable father would leave to an only son. He had replaced it with a will that left everything to Doris, with the remainder going to the female line of the family, the nieces, the eventual great-niece in Bristol, and nothing, categorically nothing, to Edmund. And he had placed that will, the true will, the one he wished to govern his estate, in the outbuilding, among garden records, not in the filing cabinet of the study, where a will would normally be kept. In the outbuilding, where it would be less immediately visible, less accessible to challenge, but where it could be found if someone knew to look. Edmund had known. Edmund, before he left, had gone to the elder Mr. Harland and left a letter. A letter sealed against Thomas Laveraing's life. A letter that said, in whatever precise form Edmund had found, something equivalent to, "My father has made a will that cuts me out. He has done this because of my nature, which he finds unacceptable. If something happens to him, I want it known that I believe this will to be the expression of his prejudice and not his genuine intention for his estate." And Miss Marple now thought she could see this. Edmund had known or suspected where the will was kept, because Thomas had told him, or because Edmund knew his father well enough. The letter had arrived after Thomas's death. The elder Mr. Harland had read it. He had conducted his own quiet inquiry. He had found the will in the outbuilding and had administered it as he was legally bound to do. But he had not, and this was the detail that Dorothy had given her, and that she was now turning in the morning light. He had not been satisfied. He had recorded his dissatisfaction nowhere, had put nothing in writing, had told only his wife, who had told only Margaret Calhoun, who had told only Dorothy Phelps. The will was legal. Edmund had been found and had raised no objection. The estate had passed to Doris and eventually to the great-niece in Bristol. And Edmund had been in Australia, living in a country that had, at least, more space and more sky than the village where his father had looked at him and found him wanting. She stopped on the farm track and looked out across the fields. The plowed earth, the bare trees at the field's edge, the enormous sky of an October morning without cloud. She felt, standing there, the weight of it. Not the weight of the injustice alone, though that was there, but the weight of the particular kind of damage that is done when a person's claim to ordinary human belonging is denied by the one person whose acceptance they have a right, above all others, to expect. Thomas Laveraing had been a man who did thorough work. He had been right about that. When he decided something, he did not look back. He had looked at his son and decided, and he had enacted the decision with the full resources available to him. The will, the silenced house, the years of Doris's careful diminishment, and he had died before any of it could be undone. Edmund had left a letter. That was the thing. In the middle of his own expulsion from everything he had grown up expecting to inherit. The house, the family, the father's eventual recognition. In the middle of all of that, Edmund had thought clearly enough to leave a letter. Not to accuse exactly, not to contest, but to ensure that someone knew. That the elder Mr. Harland, at least, would know what the will was and why it had been where it had been placed. She walked on. The coal was very clean. Who had been in the outbuilding? The boots. Fresh mud. Someone who had been in the village recently, or who was still in the village, who had a reason to go to Linden House's outbuilding and had the habit of removing muddy boots before entering. Someone who knew where the outbuilding was. Someone who had perhaps not known until the clearance began and the estate's settlement moved toward completion, that the time had come to look. Edmund himself would be 68 now, if he were alive. She did not know whether he was in this country. She did not know whether he had come back. But she knew that the great niece in Bristol had taken no interest in the house, and that the clearance had been managed entirely at arm's length, and that the papers, the family correspondence going back decades, were on their way to the county archive. And she knew that someone had been in that garden, in the outbuilding, recently. She thought, the cardboard box of papers that the young woman had carried out of the house, the bundles of letters with the dried rubber bands. What if Edmund had written not only to the solicitor, but to his mother? What if in 50 years he had written letters to Doris, to his mother, alone in that house, living in the minimum of her life, and she had kept them, as mothers do, and they were now in a box on their way to the county archive? She came back into the village by the high street, nodded to Arthur Plimpton, who was cycling back from somewhere with his lamp on out of pure habit, and went home. She sat down at the kitchen table. She knew who was responsible. She knew what had been chosen. She knew what the choosing had cost. Thomas Lavering had been dead for 50 years. Edmund Lavering was, she believed, alive, and had come back to the edge of his own life, drawn by the clearance of the house, looking perhaps for letters, perhaps for some version of the past that he could finally take with him when the past was finally done. She felt, sitting in her kitchen in the October morning with the robin on the garden wall, and the cold frames in good order, and the season exactly where it ought to be, the particular and not ungentle sadness of someone who has finally understood a thing that has been almost understood for a very long time. Not grief exactly, not anger at all, a recognition, the sensation of a long question receiving, at last, its quiet and unhurried answer. Chapter 9. A Visit to Young Mr. Harland. She telephoned on Monday morning and asked if she might come at 10. He said of course. He had the tone of a man who had been expecting the call. She walked along the high street in a light rain that had begun at breakfast, carrying her umbrella, though it was not heavy enough to strictly require one. The village in the rain had its own quality, a drawing in, a sense of interiors being preferred over exteriors, the wet pavement reflecting the light from the shop windows in long wavering columns, the smell of damp leaves and old stone that was, for Miss Marple, so thoroughly the smell of home that she could not have described it except to say that any place that did not smell of it felt, in some essential way, provisional. Young Mr. Harland had a fire on again. She took the better chair. He brought the same careful, wary attention as before, but there was something different in it this time. Not greater, exactly, but more specific. Focused. I've been thinking, Miss Marple said, about Edmund Lavering. He waited. I've been thinking about Edmund since the clearance began. I've been here a long time, as you know, and one accumulates a considerable amount of stored attention over 60-odd years in a village. Things one noticed at the time, for no reason one could have articulated. Small things, filed in the particular way that the mind files small things it doesn't know the use of yet. Yes, he said. I think Edmund may be alive, she said. I think he may be in England. I think he may, in fact, have been in or near St. Mary Mead in the past few days. Young Mr. Harland was very still. I noticed on Thursday morning that the door to the outbuilding at Linden House was open slightly, and that there was a pair of boots inside with fresh mud on them. A large size. I mentioned this to you, and you arranged for the door to be secured, which was the right thing to do. But I've been thinking about who might have left them there. I see, he said. Edmund left a letter with your father before he went, she said. In 1974. He was 20 years old, and he left a letter with a solicitor sealed against his father's life, which tells me that Edmund was an unusually clear-thinking young person. It also tells me that Edmund believed, even then, that his father might do something that needed to be on the record. He was right. The will was found in the outbuilding. Your father administered it correctly. Edmund, when found, raised no objection. He did not, said young Mr. Harland. What I wonder, Miss Marple said. And here she was very careful, because this was the territory where she was working from inference rather than knowledge, and she knew the difference is whether Edmund, at that time, had already come to some private arrangement that satisfied him. Whether there was something in the house, in the outbuilding, or elsewhere, that he had left, or that his mother had kept for him, that constituted his own kind of inheritance. Not the legal one. A different kind. She paused. I wonder, she said, whether his mother may have kept letters. His letters to her, or her letters to him, drafts she had made, copies, or simply the original she had not sent but had not destroyed either. Letters that would tell the story of the family from the inside, from Doris's perspective, which we have not yet had. Young Mr. Harland reached into his desk drawer and produced a folder. He set it on the desk between them. He did not open it. The young woman managing the estate found this, he said, in the cardboard box of papers. She brought it to me on Thursday afternoon. I have been considering what to do with it. Miss Marple looked at the folder. It was an old folder. The card cover, once buff, had gone to a deep amber, and the label on the front had been written in a woman's hand, with a pen that had been dipped, not filled. For Edmund, if he comes. For Edmund, if he comes. She looked at the folder for a long moment. Then she looked at young Mr. Harland. Doris knew he might come, she said quietly. She kept in the papers. She knew that if Edmund ever came back, the papers would eventually be what he found, or what was found for him. That is what I believe, said young Mr. Harland. Is he alive? He is, said young Mr. Harland. I had reason, independently, not through the boots. I had reason to think he might have returned to England some time ago. I made an inquiry. He is in England. He is 70 years of age, not 68. I had the birth month wrong in my records. A brief pause. He was born in November. I thought so, Miss Marple said. He doesn't know about the folder, said young Mr. Harland. He doesn't know the papers have been cleared. He doesn't know about the archive arrangement. He was not contacted when the great-niece died. The estate was a relatively simple matter, legally speaking, and he has no claim on it. He doesn't know that his mother left a folder with his name on it in the papers of a house being cleared by a firm from Hertford. He's been to the outbuilding, Miss Marple said. I believe so. Looking for something he left, or something he hoped she had left. One or the other. He should have the folder, Miss Marple said. Simply, not as a conclusion to an argument. Simply, as the plainest and most obvious thing in the world. He should, said young Mr. Harland. The legal question is slightly delicate. It was found in the papers of an estate that is not his. But in practical terms, and in human terms, and in the terms that I think my father would have wanted applied, if he could have applied them, yes, he should have it. Would it help, Miss Marple said, if I told you that I remember quite clearly a conversation I had with Doris Levering some years before she left the house, in which she mentioned a folder of letters she was keeping for her son? Quite clearly. Young Mr. Harland looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has just been offered something that is technically slightly more than the evidence strictly supports, but which is offered with such serene certainty that questioning it feels both unnecessary and slightly impolite. "It would help," he said, "if that were the case." "It is the case," said Miss Marple. She could not have said, in a court of law, whether it was precisely the case. She could have said, with complete honesty, that she had spoken with Doris Lavering on several occasions in the years before Doris had left for the nursing home, and that Doris had in those conversations communicated in the indirect and coded language of a woman who had learned to say only as much as she believed was safe. A number of things about Edmund that were not entirely unlike the expression of someone who was keeping something for someone. Whether there had been a specific mention of a folder was a question she declined to put directly to herself. But the folder existed, and Doris had made it, and Edmund was alive. And for 50 years he had been at the distance to which his father had reduced him, and the right thing to do was the right thing to do. "I'll make contact," said young Mr. Harland. He placed the folder back in his drawer. "I'll write to him. It may take some time. I'll need to confirm his current address." "Of course," said Miss Marple, rising. "There is one thing I wondered if you can say." "If I can. The letter Edmund left with your father in 1974. The sealed letter. Was it destroyed when the estate was settled, or is it still in the firm's records?" Young Mr. Harland was quiet for a moment. Then, "Our retention policy for sealed client letters is 75 years from the date of deposit. We are in the 63rd year." "I see," said Miss Marple. "It is technically still a client document," he said. "It would accompany any communication regarding the estate in the ordinary course of things." "Edmund will receive his own letter back," Miss Marple said. "The one he wrote when he was 20. When he was explaining himself to a world that had decided it didn't want the explanation." "He will," said young Mr. Harland. Miss Marple put on her coat in the small entrance hall, under the framed photograph of the elder Mr. Harland that had been there since she could remember, and went out into the rain. Chapter 10. What the Village Holds. She took the long way home. She went past the church, where the old clock was preparing itself again to strike 11 with its usual approximate sincerity. She went through the lich gate and along the path inside the churchyard, not to any particular grave, not to look for anything, not with any specific intention, but because she sometimes walked through the churchyard the way she sometimes read the last chapter of a book she had already read, not for information, but for the particular quality of attention that familiar things, at the right moment, provide. The churchyard in October rain was very still. The yew at the south wall was the same yew that had been there when she first came to the village, and it had been old then. It would be here long after the last person who now remembered it was gone, which she had always found one of the most comforting thoughts available to the human mind. Not because she wished to be commemorated, but because she had great faith in the continuity of things that did not require human attention in order to continue. She did not look for the Laverian graves. She knew they were in the south quarter. She knew their approximate position. She did not look at them. She continued along the path and out through the south gate onto Church Lane. Linden House was on her left. The clearance was complete now. The iron gate was latched. The Virginia creeper had shed another portion of its leaves in the weekend's rain, so that now the old brick was almost fully visible. The creeper itself still present, its bare stems fine and dark against the pale rose of the old stone, the remaining leaves concentrated in the upper portions where the warmth of the wall had held longest, still very red, burning there with a kind of last, quiet insistence. She stopped at the gate. She stood in the rain, which was light enough that it was more presence than precipitation, more the feeling of the air being involved in something wet than any actual falling of water to speak of. She looked at the house. Edmund Lavering was 70 years old. He had been 20 when he left. He had lived 50 years in the knowledge that his father had looked at him and found him wanting, not wrong, not mistaken, but wanting, as if to be what Edmund was were a deficiency, an incompleteness, a falling short of the standard that Thomas Lavering had set without consultation and enforced without appeal. He had lived 50 years with the particular weight of having been left nothing. Not the legal weight. Money can be earned, property replaced, material inheritances reconstructed by the work of a lifetime. The other weight, the weight of having been told, in the formal and legally binding language of a last will and testament, that you were not worth the inheritance of ordinary affection. He had written a letter. That was what she kept returning to. 20 years old, expelled from his own history, and he had gone first to the solicitor and left a letter that said, "Someone should know." Not a protest, not an accusation that would require the law's intervention, because Edmund was already clever enough to know that the law could not reach where his father had hurt him, but a record, a placing of the facts on the record in the hands of someone who would keep them until the facts were needed. And Doris had kept a folder. Doris Levering, careful, thin, habitually deferential Doris, had in the decades of her solitary life in Linden House assembled a folder and labeled it in her good, dipped pen hand, "For Edmund, if he comes." She had placed it in the family papers not by accident, but deliberately, exactly as Thomas had placed his punishing will in the garden records, but with the opposite intention. Thomas had hidden his cruelty in the ordinary documents of a domestic life. Doris had hidden her love there too, in the same place, as if she had known that the archive of the family's ordinary things is the only archive that endures, the only one that keeps both the harm and the remedy with equal faithfulness. Miss Marple turned from the gate and walked on. She was thinking about the village. She had lived here for more than 60 years. She had walked these lanes in the spring when the cow parsley came up white along the verges and the whole world smelled of May. In the summer when the barley was tall and gold and the hedgerows were full and loud. In the autumn in all its varieties. The early, subtle October she was in now, and the late October when the gales came through and the last leaves went down in whole companies at once. And in the winter, which was the most honest of the seasons, stripping everything back to the essential geometry of branch and field edge and stone. She had walked this particular circuit, the church, the lane, the field path, the farm track, the high street, so many thousands of times that she could have walked it in the dark, which she sometimes had. And all the time she had been walking, the village had been holding things. In its lanes, and its gardens, and its houses. In its outbuildings, and its paperwork, and its solicitors' filing cabinets. In the quiet interiors of people who had been present and had noticed and had not known, at the time, the full weight of what they were noticing. The village did not know that it held these things. The village did not organize its knowledge or maintain an index. It simply held what had happened in it with the undiscriminating patience of a deep soil, and what it held was available to anyone who knew how to ask. Miss Marple had found, over 60-odd years, that the knowing how to ask was the work of a lifetime. Not a technique, not a system, but a quality of attention that she had come to possess by inhabitation, by living in the same place for long enough to have been present for what it contained. She had not solved the puzzle. She had not followed a trail. She had been here. She had been here the whole time. For the summer of 1974, for the finding of the will, for the decades of Doris Levering's diminishment, for the house's closing and its long, empty wait. She had filed things as they came to her, and the files had shifted when Granger's lorry came along the hayfield road on a Tuesday morning in October, and the shifting had done its slow and patient work over the following days. And now the files were open and the shape was legible. Edmund would receive a letter from young Mr. Harland. He would receive the folder that his mother had kept for him through 30 years of solitary life in that house. He would receive, folded inside the covering letter, the letter he himself had written at 20 years old, the careful, clear-thinking letter of a young man explaining himself to a future that had not yet decided whether to listen. And when he read that letter, he would find himself standing on both sides of 50 years at once, as one can only do when the past has been kept with sufficient care. She walked the high street in the rain. The greengrocers had apples in the window. The church clock struck 11 with its habitual mild approximation. A dog she did not recognize, the new vicarage dog, she thought, the uncertain breed, trotted across the road ahead of her with the purposeful air of a dog that has somewhere specific to be and has decided that the rain is irrelevant to this purpose. She stopped at the war memorial, as she sometimes did. It was a simple memorial, a cross of Portland stone, names in orderly columns. She did not read the names. She knew them too well to need to read them. But she stood for a moment in the rain's soft presence and felt the particular quality of the village in October, which was not sad, exactly, but which had something of sadness in it the way the good dark soil of autumn has in it the work of the summer already gone and the spring not yet arrived. The knowledge of absence, held in the ground that makes return possible. She walked on toward home. She thought justice, in a large and formal sense, was not available here. Thomas Lavering had been dead for 50 years. The law that had permitted what he did, or had done nothing to prevent it, had been, in any case, the law of its own time, and it had changed as laws do when the human beings who make them change, which they do, eventually under sufficient pressure and given sufficient time. No court would hear this case. No reparation of the legal kind was possible. But the other thing, the smaller, more durable thing, was possible. The folder was possible. The letter was possible. The knowledge, received by Edmund at 70, that his mother had prepared something and labeled it with his name, that was possible. The knowledge that a solicitor's firm in a village had kept his own 20-year-old voice in a filing cabinet for 50 years and was now ready to return it to him, that was possible. It was not nothing. It was, she thought, quite a great deal. She let herself in through her own front gate. She stood in the little porch, shaking the rain from her umbrella, and looked back along the lane. The trees were bare enough now to show, through the tracery of their branches, the pale gray of the October sky, which was neither gloomy nor bright, but simply present. The sky of a day that is doing exactly what a day in mid-October should do, neither more nor less. She hung her coat. She put on the kettle. She stood at the kitchen window looking at the garden, where the cold frames sat in good order and the espalier pear on the far wall held its winter structure with the calm confidence of something that has been shaped by long attention and is now thoroughly itself. She made tea. She took it to the sitting room. She sat in her chair by the fire, which she had not lit yet. The afternoon would be soon enough, and she held the cup in both hands and felt the warmth of it and thought about Edmund Lavering setting out from some address somewhere in England to come to the edge of his childhood home and enter its garden in the early morning and leave his boots in the outbuilding of a house that was being emptied of its contents and sorted for an archive and sold to people who did not yet know its history. He had come back. Of course he had come back. Things come back, given long enough and the right conditions. The way the perennial comes back through the frost-hardened ground each spring, the way the tide returns regardless of the moon's particular phase, the way a name surfaces 50 years after it was last spoken in a lane in October in a village that has been quietly holding it all this time, waiting for the question that will let it go. She set the cup down. She looked at the cold grate. She thought she would light the fire a little early today. The afternoon was damp, and she had walked a long way, and some mornings leave a chill in the bones that only a particular kind of warmth addresses. She lit the fire. She settled back. She opened her hedgerow book at the page she had marked, where the text was discussing the dormant season. The way the hedgerow in winter is not absent but waiting, not finished but resting, every root still alive in the cold ground, every bulb still carrying the summer in itself like a promise kept in the dark. And she read, and the fire built itself into steadiness, and the afternoon rain continued its quiet work on the garden, and the village beyond her window was exactly as it had always been, ordinary and unhurried and full, right to its deepest levels, with everything that had ever happened in it. She did not feel triumph. She felt the quiet completion of something that had been waiting a long time for the right weather. Outside in the lane, a car she did not recognize drove slowly past, not stopping, just passing through, and she watched it without particular attention until it was gone, and then she turned back to her book and the fire in the afternoon. Boredom tales. Some things return, whether you invite them to or not. Thank you so much for spending this evening with Harry and Warm Tales. If this story settled somewhere warm in you, please do leave a comment. Tell me where you listened from tonight. Tell me how you are. And if you haven't yet subscribed, this is a quiet and completely genuine invitation to do so. It means everything to this little channel, and it keeps these stories coming. Sleep well, dear friends. We'll be here when you return.